OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about part 3 of the VORD. So far we have talked about the Leibniz Oscillation, the fact that similarity decreases as we approach sameness, the fact that difference decreases as we approach pure difference, how this creates a way that things move and process themselves in relative vectors. And moving on, we still, though, have the question of vector transitions. So a few things. We've talked before about this vector tower. And of course, we're describing a metaphor. But in section 9 of the paper, there's going to be a graphic that might be of interest that shows subphysics at the bottom, physics after that, then chemistry built on that, biology on that, mind on that, and culture on that. And it tries to visually depict the different fields of study that might focus on a particular vector. For example, you have with biology, genetics, biochemistry, evolution. For mind, you have psychology, phenomenology, literature, so on and so forth. And then you'll also have processes that will be depicted. Say in mind, you have memory, thought, imagination, biology, photosynthesis, metabolism, reproduction. In chemistry, the Bohr's bond model, decomposition, combustion, and I could go on. So, even though there's going to be an emphasis on the Leibniz oscillation, by no means whatsoever do I want to say that that is the only process that needs to be understood. However, it would seem to me that the Leibniz oscillation has something to do with the physics vector. And if all the other vectors, except perhaps subphysics, embodies physics, that's going to mean that it is a particularly influential operation. The section is going to talk about magnets as a metaphor to describe the movement of entities, but it is important to realize that it is just a metaphor. What we're trying to describe is how when entities approach one another, how they relate, how when they're too similar, they tend to push one another apart, how when they're too different, they tend not to relate, and magnetic charges can be quite helpful for that. And so the next section of the paper will be describing, metaphorically, the Leibniz oscillation as a magnetic movement. And it's also going to clarify that earlier when you had that chart of the dots moving up, that really it's not so much that, kind of this chart in the background of being like some kind of landscape. Really, it's that was to depict how different entities approach one another at different charges, and when they approach things that are too similar, they tend to be repelled. When they approach things that are too different, they tend to be repelled. And clusters can form between entities where there is a right breakdown between similarity and difference, where they can come together and create a cluster. But then other clusters can come along and break apart those clusters, break the entities apart. Say if you have a family that is very similar to another family, and then you have mimetic rivalry that takes over. Say if you have genes that are very, very similar, they're going to potentially cause effacement because they won't be selected by natural selection because they're too similar, and so on and so forth. So I want to stress, I do think in all these different processes that you can find in each vector, they're indeed going to share similarities with the Leibniz oscillation that has to be taken seriously, and the paper hopes to show that. Now, a topic that was brought up earlier in the paper that is significant is this issue of vector transitions, or the process by which an emergent vector arises or occur. How do they occur? How do you get something that is irreducible to arise out of something? That sounds quite strange. Starting with section 9 of the paper, we will describe this issue of ontological impasses, which was also brought up earlier in the paper. And basically the notion is that when entities of a given vector move around to a place following the Leibniz oscillation, that they can no longer continue to process or move without undergoing effacement. Then it's a kind of do or die situation where either they have to emerge or cease to be. And what's interesting is we described ontological impasses as a situation where you need not being needs non-being. Note I didn't say nothing, but non-being in order to, it's the solution to an ontological impasse in the same way that non-rationality is a solution to Nash equilibria situations. So you need an example of non-being, and that would be a vector. This occurs when something is achieved through very unlikely, very rare situation called the harmony, where entities are evenly spaced, from one another. And again, we're talking metaphorically, where they're the same in their distance from one another, and yet purely different in being utterly separated. Thus, we have a situation of sameness and pure difference, which was described in section 5 as an emergent vector. So here we have a ontological situation which arises because as entities process and run against the ontological impasse, they bounce off of it per se, but of course that's a metaphor. And eventually they reach a place where entropy begins to take over, where they begin to head toward effacement, and it's a do or die. Well, if entities in a vector achieve a state of harmony, then they achieve a state of pure difference and sameness at the same time, which is fundamentally unstable. And so what you have is a situation where nothing can move horizontally. And if they can't move horizontally, then they're going to be effaced, unless they can move vertically, upward, where the magnetic charges can push upward. And relative to the previous vector, this would be an act of non-being, an act of non-ontology. It would be something that operated according to different ontological principles or processes from what is found in the previous vector. So, for example, if you can get a harmony in physics, where horizontal movement is no longer possible, the distribution of charges can arise to a vector that then pushes up, per se, vertically into the vector of chemistry. That vector then pushes back down upon the harmony, breaks it up again back into a Leibniz Oscillation distribution, and so now we have a new vector, and we return to the Leibniz Oscillation. Now, this is all, and you can just keep working up the whole vector tower as such. Now, this is all metaphoric. I don't mean to suggest that this is necessarily the way vector transitions occur or that emergent vectors arise. But for me, it is a depiction to help understand how it can occur without there being reducibility, all while maintaining irreducibility. Lang and Bard easily may have better explanations, better ways to depict it, but for me, this is quite helpful. Now, we still have issues of what I will call intervectivity, which is how do vectors relate, which is a vast mystery. How can vectors relate and not be reducible? And this will be what we will pursue in the next part of the paper. Now, as closing, I will note that with the emergence of the vector of mind, curiously, it would seem that we're capable to be toward harmony, singularity, or what is called third impact. All this is described in the Noumenon frame. It's possible now that you have the vector of mind that there could be a perhaps design, a intentional bringing about of a harmony situation that could arise to a new vector, but I'm not sure. But it is interesting to note that the emergence of mind seems to transform perhaps the rate by which harmonies are achieved, and perhaps it's quicker, so perhaps the rate of new emergences is also quicker, which would get you into culture and technology as potential vectors, but I am not sure, and that's a topic for another time. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. For the other parts of this series, you can find them on YouTube, Medium, Substack, etc. And thank you so much for your time.